I don't know. This might be it. There's a pretty good long straight section there. Might be able to make this work. So I'm trying to kind of rotate it, look down it. There's a bit of a bend. There's a little bit of a bend. Man, you can see there's a pretty good, almost perfectly straight section there. I'm tempted to use this one, or at least try, but it's not really a good candidate because it's been lying on the forest floor, and I don't really want to necessarily use something that's been on the forest floor, but it doesn't look like it's too split, although that split there kind of makes me unhappy. I don't know. I might use it, but again, trying to find a perfectly straight stick out here in the forest that's just laying around, that's a bit tricky. Well, I think I might just go ahead and give this one a shot. You can see it's not exactly perfectly straight, but it's about the straightest one I found. So we're going to need to kind of work it a little bit and get all that stuff off of there. I do things the old school way. We're just going to use a rock. You have to pardon my funny camera angle here. It's sort of hanging off my shirt. But basically, I'll just do stuff like this. Just knock them off. And then you can actually use the side of the rock to kind of sand that smooth, because this needs to be as smooth as it possibly can. So this is kind of the process. We're knocking off these things and then rubbing them smooth, knocking them off and rubbing them smooth. So this is just part of the process. The next step here is going to be sort of laying out exactly where everything's going to go. Obviously, I'm going to use the fat end as the actual grinding part, but you have to decide where your flywheel is going to go and how far down the pump handle actually is going to go. So you have to kind of think to yourself, okay, I'm going to need some extra room here so the spindle doesn't, if I tip it, the spindle spinning around in place doesn't tip over and hit into the ground as it's kind of going back and forth. I've done that with having my flywheel just a little bit too low on the spindle, and so you're going to want a good hand width at least. So the spindle's going to go, or I'm sorry, the flywheel or counterweight there is going to go there. And so that means that the pump handle can't go any farther than here. So I kind of have to think to myself, okay, this area here, maybe between these two knots is going to be where I position the flywheel. And then I'm going to have to get enough distance down here, enough cordage to be able to make that nice triangle that comes out. So the cross piece for the handle is going to be here, and then I'm going to have to make sure and put a notch in there. And I think I'm just going to cheat and use the saw to make that slot that needs to go in the top, because I've used the knife before to do that, and it takes forever. It's not easy, and traditionally you would probably just rub through there with like a really narrow edge of rock to make a slot, and I could do that, but again, this project is going to be kind of like a hybrid of old school, new school, so I'm going to take it the easy way and use a saw to make that slot. That should be a pretty easy thing to do. All right, well, there's the notch. That was a real quick task, just a couple seconds with the saw to put that in there. And one thing you might want to make sure is that it's exactly in the middle, which I kind of think I got it. And you don't really want it to be too much of a V, because then the pressure as you push down may want to split the wood apart. So try to make it more of a nice square or round slot rather than like a tight V. Okay, so for our next step, we're going to probably want to pick out a flywheel, and most people are going to try to opt for something round, and that is not how I do things. I do a paddle type flywheel, and that requires a bit of work, because unless you have random boards hanging around that you can use for that, you're going to have to actually get a chunk of branch that's something around this size, for example this, and you're going to have to split it in half after you cut it to length. And so that's where, if you were going to try and whittle that out with my little itty-bitty knife, that would not work. And so that's where a saw does kind of come in handy to be able to cut, a chunk of wood around this size. Not that thickness, obviously, but basically if you had two of these, you can sort of picture what we're going to do is like sandwich two of them across and then tie here, tie there, so it squeezes onto here. But because this is round, that won't work, because this will literally just rotate around the spindle, or whatever it is I end up using as the paddle. And so you're going to have to shape the edge of it on the inside with like sort of like a wide open sort of a V, and a matching sort of angle and angle on here. So there's a bit of a notch that fits into the spindle board and locks onto one position only on the spindle. And that's how I've done it before, and it does work as long as you get it good and tight, and a good tight fit. And that's where you're going to need to require some carving skills, and the knife again comes in. You're going to have to sit there and carve away making that notch. But it doesn't go away, it stays really well, and so that's the way we're going to do it. Only problem is, this is too lightweight, and I only have one, so I'm going to have to go find a branch that's the right thickness, split it down the middle, probably batoning with the knife, and then make sure the ends are exactly the right length either side, and so on and so forth. Well, I'm kind of browsing around looking for the right piece for my flywheel, and it's got to be a decent amount of mass. You've often seen people attaching rocks to the paddle type flywheel to give it more weight and mass. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go with brute mass, and so I'm looking for something a good 2 to 3 inches in diameter, kind of like this. You know, something you can't really get your fingers all the way around. That's not bad, but it also has to be somewhat straight, so it's got a decent amount of balance to it. Otherwise, it'll be a little wobbly when you go to spin it. So again, here we go, looking for that right one that's actually kind of straight. This looks like it's got a almost straight enough section, and it's about big enough around. I like this one. Looks larger though. I need something good 3 or 4 inches. And of course, the farther up the tree you go, they may get smaller, although that one there's pretty darn large. That's nice and fat. Tricky, tricky, tricky. So one of these I think is going to become the donor, and it's a bit of a multi-hand process. So we'll get it cut, and then we'll show you the splitting process as we get it split right down the middle, because it has to be split perfectly down the middle, or again, there won't be perfect balance. So let me get one of these picked out and cut off, and we'll get modifying it for use. Well, looks like it's going to be a decent piece for the flywheel. Nice and big around. Like I say, I want it just to where I can't quite get my fingers around it there. You know, 3-4 inches wide. That's maybe 2.5. It's a little small for a flywheel, but you know, the main thing is that it has enough mass. So I mean, size isn't necessarily the deciding factor. It actually has more to do with actually how heavy it is. So you could have a smaller flywheel than this if it was made of, you know, heavy lead or something like that. And you'll often see with a paddle type flywheel, this is going to get split in half, and we're about to give that a go. And they'll attach a rock onto either end to give it just more mass and make it spin that much better. But I'm just going to rely on the weight of it, and it's not perfectly even. It's a little bit wider on that end than this end. That might unbalance it a little bit, but shouldn't be too bad. As far as splitting it, it's got to be right in the middle, and there's actually a little split right there, it looks like. So I'm going to take my little Mora, and I'm going to run over here and grab a baton. Just another chunk of wood, big old chunk of wood you can beat on here, and I'm going to do my best to try and get this nice and centered and straight in there. We want as much blade as possible. Now, it's been suggested to me that I am not hitting this knife very hard, and therefore that's why it's not loosening the tang inside the handle. But I've done stuff like this to my heart's content. Oh yeah, the bark's coming off this thing, and the Mora doesn't give up. This is a tough little knife. An even tougher piece of wood. This is possibly easier with a different knife. I have a different knife I'm going to give this a try with, because this is not substantial enough to really cut it. So let me pause for a second here. Okay, so we're going to switch to my backup knife, which is the bushcraft model. As you can see by comparison, a little more substantial of a blade. And you know, I saw this blade as it was going through this piece of wood curving, but I'm looking down it, and despite the fact that it was bending inside the piece of wood, it isn't bent. Nice and straight still, and I see no problems with the handle or the knife going into the tang. It's exactly as tight as I've always seen it. It's perfectly fine. There's a little bit of wear on the rubber there where I was smashing into it with the baton, but held up to some serious abuse just now with 0 damage. So more knife companion. The only thing it's lacking is just enough mass to get through here, and that's where this bigger knife probably will come in a little handier. See if I can spot my camera. I'm having a hard time seeing the camera. So here we go. This should be a little bit of an easier process now. Making a hole in the ground. Come on, split. I'm just going to pry it. There we go. Now, it never splits evenly there, but it does always split nice and evenly there. So, you have to make sure and mate up either side. And since you probably can see the thickness difference, I'm probably gonna have to shave some of that off just to make them balance a little easier. But that's not very ideal at all, but you do the best you can. All right, it was a hard fight, but we got it split in half, got the right piece. And the only thing we need now to do is make a little bit of a notch in each side, or I guess a divot that's going to fit. There's a plane and a plane, so there's sort of like an angle here. If I can see, make sure I'm in the camera. And the reason why there's an angle there and there's an angle there is because I'm going to make a matching or inverse slot or notch into the middle of this so that it can't rotate, because this is going to be going and each time these are going to want to keep moving when you come to a stop, and so they've got to be locked in place tight. And the other thing, in order to affix them onto there with enough pressure, we're going to need a groove probably here and then on the opposite end somewhere in there in order to have the paracord to ride in. But first we got to get that center notch so it'll actually stay on the spindle. So I'm just going to do a quick down and dirty measure. What's half of this? Somewhere right around in there. Boom. Okay. That halfway? There. There's your halfway mark. Nice and straight and flat. Okay, that's that. Now, we need to get a notch here and a notch there, and those notches really need to match up with the actual holes, or with each other. So I definitely want to try and at least line up a little bit of it. Okay, so now you can kind of see what we're trying to do here is put this on here on those slots where it's feeling like it's locked in pretty darn good. That doesn't want to move, at least on this side. It matches up very nicely. That side, not so much. But then we're just going to cinch it here and cinch it here. All right, well, I'm not sure if I'm necessarily going to do the split method and do a split stick. I'm kind of thinking I might just do two sticks together. That does mean I'll have to create a little bit of a divot in order for there to be room for the spindle, but it does also mean that I'm going to have to clean up some of this stuff here and do some work on these two sticks. I think these two sections right here are just going to work, like maybe from there and then maybe to like roughly there. That's just about enough length, you know, if you kind of look. Yeah, that's just about right. So I'm going to have to knock off some of these notches, cut off the butt ends, and create a little divot here and a little divot there in order to get it to work. So let's get to work. Yeah, this is the problem with doing it this way, is sometimes you can go too far. The thing though is this isn't being torqued in half, it's going to be pushed down, so this might still hold. I think I'll give it a shot. The only other things that need to be done for this now are to actually tie together here and here so that they stay, and you know that'll be assisted much more easily if I give myself another notch for that paracord to ride in. That's not too bad, I guess. All right, now there is a roughly completed pump handle, and it should, with any luck, sorry, I'm blocking everything here, with a bit of luck, this will actually work. So I have to get it put together now. All right, so I got the two pump handle pieces tied together. Kind of a finicky, pain in the butt process. It's a little difficult to film, but I got them put together. Really simple knots. They're not exactly perfect, but it's as good as it needs to be for this project. So what we need to do next is get our handy dandy spindle and see how we did. Let's get her put in. Kind of hard to do this two-handed. Hold the phone and do something. I need 3 hands. Whoa. So then we're going to drop the cord into the slot, and there you have it. Now, how do you know if you got it right? Well, it should be able to basically spin on its own, and there you go. Look at that. Beautiful. And see how it's just on its own, freely moving. And there's that twisting action. All right, that's so cool. Nice and no resistance. You don't want any resistance off of this, otherwise it's just going to fight and it'll be a pain in the buns. But this is one of the harder parts here, is getting this to where it's just about right. And previously I've done it where I tied here, and then knotted the two in the middle. But the knot kind of sometimes isn't always easy to deal with right here. It wants to slip out sometimes. But so I basically did a loop there and a loop there, and then just sort of like thread the loops through each other. And so the downward pressure as I push on it should help keep it tight. But one thing that you could do to make it work a little better is make, it's kind of hard to do with 2 hands here, is make a flat spot between these two so that they can't roll side to side. Because what can happen is they won't stay right next to each other. Like the one on the left may go down and the one on the right may go up, and then it will definitely bind on the spindle. But the way I'm doing it, the downward pressure should keep it in place. And I think that's pretty darn good. I'm very, very happy to see it spin freely on its own like that, doing that twisting around the top and going back and forth. So that should be pretty cool. The only trouble that I'm a little worried about is I've got a little bit of a nick there, and that could snap. But the only thing left to do is now put the flywheel on where we made our little notches for the flywheel, and then we are ready to start pumping. Exciting! All right, well, I found a little divot in this big rock here, this big boulder sticking up out of the ground, and I think I'm going to use that divot just to see if the mechanics work. This is just kind of a dry run before I even attempt to start making friction fire or at least generate some smoke. And the key, obviously, is loading up the handle, and then you should not have to push too hard down to get it to continue to spin. Look at that. Well, look at that. That's how fast it can stand. Well, that's a functioning pump drill. The handle's a little finicky, but that's perfectly fine. Let's see. Yep, there's heat being generated, and it's you can see it's trying to grind it away. There's some sawdust there already. So it works. Let's get a fireboard, or hearth as we call it in friction fire, and see if we can at least get some smoke. Well, we've got our proven set built here, ready to go. I've got my fireboard. The only thing missing is a notch to catch the hot dust that this should generate. And I'm not actually trying to start a fire, I just want to see smoke, because there's a fire ban and I don't need to start a fire. So I just want to prove that this can get at least close to combustion temperature. And when you see smoke like that, you pretty much are guaranteed that you're pretty darn close. A few more seconds of work, maybe 30 to 60 seconds with the pump drill, and you should actually have a good burning ember or a coal built up there. But let's at least try to get some smoke. I just gotta be careful, because if you lift up too fast, this may pop out, and that's where having maybe some extra weight on it will help it not come back out of the hole when you lift. And you may notice that it starts to bind in the hole. That means it's getting hot. I'm not going too fast here. Let's go a little bit faster. And as you can see, we got smoke. We have black dust building up. That's a functioning, proven set. We can make friction fire. That is awesome. It's so darn cool. And look at it, still smoking. It's exactly what you want to see. And I'm not nearly as out of breath as I should be if I was using a pump drill. And that's why this works so much better than bow drill. So much better than bow drill, because with bow drill, you have to brace with your foot, and then you have to brace around your knee, pushing downward on the bearing block, and then push this way with your bow. And this is pushing your power stroke this way does not provide pressure down into the place where the actual friction is supposed to be. Pushing down with the bearing block makes the friction. This tends to make your spindle pop out, and that's one of the big disasters of bow drill, is having that spindle pop out because you're trying to push this way and this way, as opposed to this, where you're pushing straight down every time. Ooh, there's a big breeze coming up. Another good reason to not have a fire, because your power strokes here are going straight into the target area. Straight into the target area, straight into the target area. The only chance of it popping out again is if you lift a little too hard on the release. And it's just so cool and satisfying to have made a mechanical device all from scratch, all on my own. You know, I didn't look this up. This is a skill I've taught myself. But I definitely hope that you give this a try, because there's a lot of different ways to do this. You could have a circular stone, you could have a plank here instead, you could tie a knot here so it won't slip side to side and become uneven. You could do a split stick, you could do rocks on the end of this. And I will say that is one thing you could do to increase your downward pressure, is add some more weight here so you don't have to push down so hard yourself. This will start to sort of polish, so you might not necessarily need to lubricate it. It may sort of polish itself, but you could use some lard or something if that would help. And I will say it helps to have this come down to a point, because if you have a blunt, flat end, all of your downward pressure, say 50 pounds, is being distributed across that whole area. If you have it come to a point like this, if you sort of see how it comes to a point, that'll help drive your force directly into a smaller point, and that'll help you create more friction. You know, the reason knives are pointy is because you can apply all your force into that tiny point, and it's for sure going to go in. But other than that, it's pretty much how you want to make it. It's a really satisfying project. It's a lot of fun, and it's a connection with not just old history, ancient prehistory, but more recent history. Not only is this a classic method that ancient prehistory or primitive peoples, or maybe not so primitive peoples, would use to make fire and bore holes in things. That's why it's called a drill and not a fire maker, because it can do all sorts of things. But when you're a kid going to the living history days like I was, and seeing these things and trying them and being so fascinated with this, non-electric drill and how people used to do things, it's a fun kind of connection with my childhood. There's a little bit of nostalgia there, which is really, really cool. And this is just such a cool project. It's fun to make, and you can do, like I said, any variation on it. You don't have to make it look like this, and I would love to see what yours looks like. I definitely encourage you to try this skill, this technique. It's so much fun, and you learn a lot about woodworking. You learn about cordage, about knots, about mechanics, balance, all sorts of things. Really, really worthy project, and I definitely want to thank you so very much for joining me during this process. It's been a bit of a process, so I'm sure there's a little bit of patience involved in just sitting there watching it all go through, but I really, really appreciate you joining me. It's been a heck of a lot of fun, and I can't say thank you enough for joining me while I make my pump drill here in camp and practice some of these primitive living skills.